Happy little games. Growing up, there was nothing better than plopping down in front of the TV with a bowl of honeycomb on Saturday mornings while I watched my various cartoons. And, believe it or not, there was also nothing better than playing video games on my wood-grained Atari 2600. So when the two were merged together thanks to the wizards at Cinematronics, I was in heaven. At least for the 15 seconds my 50 cents got me until the game was over. This was very similar to the episode of Taxi where Jim Ignatowski plays Pac-Man for the first time.
That was the greatest thrill of my life!
Today, we are going to take a look at a sequel that was another massive hit. This sequel would feature once again an unsuspecting hero as he attempts to vanquish evil and save the day. No, I'm not talking about Tyler Perry's Boo 2 A Medea Halloween. I'm talking about the sword-wielding, very virile, Dirk the Daring, who is the star of the arcade game Dragon's Lair 2 Time Warp. Why did it take 6 years for this game to be released? Why were the home versions released a full year before the arcade game came out? So carry on, brave adventurers. This is the history of Dragon's Lair 2 Time Warp. The year is 1983 and work has just begun on the sequel to the smash hit Dragon's Lair. For those of you who don't know, Dragon's Lair was one of the first successful Laserdisc arcade games and helped pave the way for all future full-motion video offerings. The game was conceived by Rick Dyer, president of Microcomputer Systems, which was later renamed to RDI Video Systems. He had been working on a fantasy game for over 2 years but had hit a brick wall. One night, after being as stressed out as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, he went to see The Secret of NIMH, which featured spectacular animation by Don Bluth. He had attended the 1982 Amusement and Music Operator Association show and had seen the Sega Laserdisc title Astron Belt and was thoroughly impressed with the full motion video and real-time 2D graphics. Laserdisc technology offered a higher resolution than standard Betamax or VHS thanks to it being stored on giant analog discs. He felt that the spectacular animation on Secret of NIMH would be a perfect fit for what he had in mind. A 3-way partnership was entered between Rick Dyer's company, Don Bluth, and arcade manufacturer Cinematronics. The finished product was an enormous success, featuring 22 minutes of hand-drawn, cel-shaded cartoon goodness. If you walked into an arcade in 1983, thanks to the booming audio, you knew there was a Dragon's Lair cabinet somewhere inside. The game was so popular and the crowds were so large, an extra monitor was placed on top of the cabinet so everybody could get a glimpse. To be honest, the gameplay was very limited and the Laserdisc players had a tendency to break down. Also, the gameplay was more about repetition, but still, it was a thing of beauty and most kids from the era remember it fondly. A lot of the profits from Dragon's Lair went to funding the next series of Laserdisc games, including Space Ace and 70% of Dragon's Lair 2. The budget for the sequel was $2.3 million, but apparently that just wasn't enough. In March of 1984, distributor Cinematronics canceled the sequel despite it being close to completion as the novelty of Laserdisc games had worn off. Over the next 5 years, Sullivan Bluth Productions would work on the title off and on, hoping they could secure another arcade manufacturer. The Leland Corporation purchased Cinematronics in 1987 and gave the green light for the follow-up to be completed and released. Despite the animation being completed in 1988, the game was not released until a few years later. And strangely enough, the home computer conversions were released a full year before the arcade game, but more on that later. By this point, Rick Dyer had moved on to create his own set of FMV titles, so it was Don Bluth and his team of animators that were tasked with finishing the project. From the beginning of the sequel's development, the team wanted something bigger in scope with a grand adventure, all for the low cost of 50 cents a play. The structure of the game is a bit different from the original Dragon's Lair. Rather than using randomized video clips as found in the first game, this one follows a linear sequence which flows from one scene to the next, creating one seamless cartoon story. When you die in a level, and trust me, you will die a lot, it forces you to resume from a checkpoint on that level rather than starting a randomly different level as found in the original game. Something else that was added was the ability to collect golden treasures which are scattered throughout the game. These are required to reach the final scenes. If the player misses any of the treasures but makes it to the end of the game, it loops back around to where the first treasure was missed. Just like the first game and Space Ace, the silky smooth animation is worth the price of admission alone. They don't do it like this nowadays with computers and limited budgets, so if you love the old style of cartoons, it's a visual treat for your eyeballs. Even in this early production form, you can see how smooth the animation is and the characters seem almost alive. They were able to get the band back together with Dan Molina returning to voice Dirk the Daring, Vera Pacheco as Princess Daphne, and the one and only Michael Rye as the narrator. They were joined by Al Smith, who provided the voice of Mordroc and Daphne's mother. The insane death scenes for Dirk have also made their return, but with more variety this time around. The studio must have been tripping on LSD because the characters are wild and wacky. We get everything from dinosaurs to the Mad Hatter, an encounter in Beethoven's studio, being chased by Eve in the Garden of Eden, and much, much more. As you can see on the title screen, it says copyright 1988 Bluth Group, but underneath that it says licensed exclusively to Nintendo. This is very odd because there was no deal between Nintendo and the Bluth Group.
Dragon's Lair. Time warp.
Kidnapped? Oh, Daddy!
Idiot!
Spirited away to a wrinkle in time by the evil wizard Mordroc. Daphne will be forced to marry the wicked Mordroc unless Dirk can save her.
My Daphne kidnapped!
Mommy's gone.
Transported by a bumbling old time machine, Dirk begins the rescue mission.
Mine!
Do it for the children. Once the casket of doom has opened, Mordroc will place the death ring upon Daphne's finger in marriage, and she will be lost forever in the Time Warp.
Dragon's Lair 2 Time Warp was released in the arcades in 1991. The game takes place a number of years after the events of the first game, where Dirk the Daring has legally changed his name to Dirk the Diggler thanks to the number of kids he has spawned. Daphne has been kidnapped by the evil wizard Mordroc, who was the owner of the castle you had to explore in the first game. Mordroc plans to marry Daphne with something called a death ring, which will turn her into a hideous monster much like himself. Mordroc travels through time to various points throughout history, and Dirk has to chase him using a time machine which has been possessed by Mordroc's brother. The game is a 1 or 2 player fantasy experience that will have you rubbing your eyes in disbelief. The game takes place across 8 areas of silky smooth, awesomely animated Don Bluth goodness. If you love traditional animated cartoons, then this is the game for you. The gameplay is identical to the first game, so if you are familiar with that, then you won't have any problems here. For the uninitiated, the first game introduced the QuickTime or QTE style of gameplay. The controls are pretty basic, with you being able to push up, down, left, and right, and using a single fire button for your sword. Rather than controlling the player directly, you are reacting to on-screen button prompts which will trigger pre-drawn success or failure animations. Time Warp gives us more of the same types of scenes we encountered in the first game, but this time around, the scenes are longer without interruptions, making the game a bit more difficult. Memorization and repetition plays a big part and does require a lot of trial and error. In addition to making it through the room successfully, you have to pick up the treasures that are scattered throughout. Some of these are difficult to spot, so you really have to pay attention because this can be frustrating. If you haven't collected all of the treasures when you reach Mordroc, you have to go back and retrieve the ones that you missed. Similar to the first game, some scenes are randomly mirrored from left to right at various points. The death scenes make their return, and this time around they appear to be a bit more brutal on poor Dirk. Here are a few of my favorites. The stages you encounter over this epic adventure are Singe's Castle,
I know you're in here. I raised a princess who married a frog. You can run, boy, Bruce. You cannot hide.
Land Before Time, which is a direct reference to Don Bluth's animated classic of the same name.
My hero!
Get the sword! Hurry, son!
Dirk in Wonderland.
Was brilliant the slightly toads to gyre and gimble in the waveful mimsy were the borgos and the moonrats outreach. Oh,
The Garden of Eden.
Mine.
Oh, no! Oh, dear! Dear! Oh, my goodness!
Beethoven's Creative Gust.
Daphne's mine! You fool! Dirk the Daring, stay put, don't...
Ancient Egypt.
You found her this time, boy!
This way.
The Ring.
You fool! You want Daphne? Go get her!
And finally, Daphne awakens. If you are able to defeat Mordroc and safely escape the crumbling castle, you are treated to a nice animated ending sequence.
Dirk, my hero!
Daphne!
As I mentioned, the character designs and level layouts are absolutely insane, with excellent scenes involving Beethoven and Wonderland among my personal favorites. Watching Dirk's mother-in-law try to bash his head in with a rolling pin gets me every time. Once again, Daphne looks great and her body really snapped back into shape after having 10 kids thanks to rigorous amounts of Pilates. Unlike the first game, which had a lot of unused content, this game only had one deleted scene. It was never fully animated and only the storyboard animatic exists. This was featured on the Dragon's Lair trilogy compilation that came out a number of years ago. A scaled back version was included in Dragon's Lair 3 for the Amiga and other home computers. The original ending of the game was a little bit different. Initially, the developers wanted to use the treasure system to make the game easier. If you collected all the treasures, the game would end after the 7th stage, cutting out the part where Daphne turns into a hideous monster. The Dragon's Lair trilogy compilation added a director's cut mode which restores this version of the game, as well as 3 death scenes that were not in the final game. Although the arcade game came out in 1991, the home computer versions were released in 1990. ReadySoft, who sold a ton of copies of the original and Space Ace on the Amiga and Atari ST, once again were behind the conversions of Time Warp. Because the arcade game was not released at this point, the developers had to rely on a VHS tape which had a complete playthrough. Since it was on VHS and not Laserdisc, obtaining high quality images were a bit of a problem. In order for the fine folks at ReadySoft to do their job, they have to digitize a series of images, separate the foreground from the backgrounds, putting the details back into each image by hand, and then editing the palette down to 16 colors. At the time, it took an average of 2 hours to compress a single frame. The game was packed onto 6 floppy disks, but a lot of the scenes were missing due to the size limitations on the floppies. If you strung all the scenes together, it comes out to about 3.5 minutes of animation spread over those 6 floppies. All of this could have been yours for the hefty price tag of £45, which, adjusted for inflation, is close to £100 today. It didn't matter though, because the game was another success for ReadySoft, and the following year, they released Dragon's Lair 3 The Curse of Mordred, which, as I mentioned, used a scaled back version of the pirate ship not seen in the arcade game. It also featured a new opening and ending. The first version we are looking at is the one and only Amiga version. The original Dragon's Lair was one of the main reasons why I purchased an Amiga 500 after watching a demo of it at our local computer store. If you are a fan of the original release or the follow-up Escape from Singe's Castle, then you'll know what to expect here. As I mentioned, this game had a lot of the content removed, with only 20% of the scenes from the arcade game present here. The animation is not as smooth and the colors are not as vibrant, but to see a cartoon running on your home computer back in 1990 was jaw-droppingly cool. Something that does make this game a bit more difficult is that there are no flashing hints helping guide you along the way, so until you have it memorized, it does come down to a lot of trial and error. The sound effects and music are fantastic, with loud, booming voices and sound effects. The playability is just like the arcade game minus the flashing hints. Thankfully, you are allowed to save your game at various points. These floppy versions are merely a curiosity, especially with CD-ROM technology gaining in popularity soon after this game was released. As you can see, the Atari ST version is very similar to the Amiga, although not running quite as smoothly. The sound effects and music are similar to the Amiga, although not packing the same amount of punch. Aside from the slightly slower gameplay speed, the controls are exactly like the Amiga version. The MS-DOS version is very similar to the Amiga version. The game runs almost identically in terms of speed. This version has the same fantastic sound and music along with the same gameplay.
Oh, you bring Dirk here. Boil in the mud, you meddling old fool.
The game was also released for the Macintosh, but I could not get it to run for some strange reason. Thanks to CD-ROM technology becoming cheaper and home CD-ROM based consoles becoming more popular, a number of systems were slated to receive a port of Time Warp. Sega CD, Jaguar, 3DO, Mac CD-ROM, and PC CD-ROM were all going to receive its own version, but none of them were ever released. In 1994, the only way to play this at home properly was with a CDI system. This version turned out fantastic and was as close to the arcade original as you were going to get at the time. Everything from the arcade game made it over, and it plays great.
Oh, it's hot. Oh, it's hot. Oh, Dirk, do something. Oh.
A DVD version was released in 1998, which, as you might expect, was arcade perfect and, once again, the best way to play it at home. at least until the Blu-ray version came out in 2009. This version is fantastic with its utterly gorgeous visuals. It's not 100% perfect though, as they use the MPEG-2 compression codec, which causes some noise and artifacting. It's not terrible to the point where it ruins the experience, and it only shows up in a few spots. You can play the game in either 4:3 or 16:9, but the artifacting occurs in both aspect ratios. There is a nice picture-in-a-picture video commentary from Don Bluth and Gary Goldman, which offers lots of information. There is also an interview with the creators as well as the animatic of the pirate ship scene. Once again, another fantastic version of the game.
Daphne's mine! You fool! Dirk the Daring, stay...
A version was released for the Nintendo DSiWare service for the DSi. While it is very cool to see Time Warp running on such a small device, due to the dual screens it's a bit hard to play, especially for beginners. Because the screens are so small, it's hard to see the flashing hints. Also, due to the compression that was used, the visuals are a bit so-so and don't really pop like they did in the arcade or CD and DVD releases. It does include the original and director's cut, and although you can enable infinite lives, it does not include a difficulty level, which was found in the first Dragon's Lair for the system. All in all though, it plays just like you would expect, so if you want to wear some Coke bottle glasses, then you might just enjoy this version on your DSi.
Never fear the creative gust. With the torn and upward think on. Think on. Soon downward sink.
Dragon's Lair Trilogy was a compilation of games including the original, Time Warp, and Space Ace. This included a number of extras including interviews with the developers and the animatic of the pirate ship scene. This was released for a number of platforms including the Nintendo Wii, the Nintendo Wii U, Xbox, PlayStation, Switch, and Steam. The game has also been released for both Android and iOS. The game was included as part of the uber cool arcade 1-up cabinet that included the original, Time Warp, and Space Ace. This is a thing of beauty, folks, so if you can't afford a real cabinet and you are a fan of this game, this is the next best thing. A fantastic homebrew version was put out by software developer Brutal Deluxe for the Apple II GS. This is an amazing conversion and was ported from either the Amiga or Atari ST version. The sound does take a hit and it's not very clear, but it does play identically to the other 16-bit versions.
Away! No visitors! Back! Now stop right there! One more step and you're finished!
Everybody that knows me knows how much I loved my Amiga 500, so I wanted to showcase another piece of homebrew from user by the name of Hash. Now this is only the intro animation, but he wanted to create it frame by frame on the Amiga 500, and that's exactly what he did. He used a program called Personal Paint, and now he just wants some coder to step up and turn it into a demo. Either way, it's very impressive to see it running on the Amiga.
Kidnapped!
Mommy's gone.
Transported by a bumbling old time machine, Dirk begins the rescue mission.
Mine!
Do it for the children. Once the casket of doom has opened, Mordroc will place the death ring upon Daphne's finger in marriage, and she will be lost forever in the Time Warp.
And that is it, my friends. I have completed the trilogy of original Don Bluth Laserdisc arcade games. Not everyone was impressed by these types of games, but personally they were fun to play, but even more so to watch, just so you can appreciate the gorgeous animation. If you've never had a chance to try this game out and you are a fan of traditional cel-shaded classic animation, be sure and give this game a shot. You'll be glad you did. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. If you would like to contribute but not sign up for my Patreon, you can always click the donate button up above. Thanks everyone for watching.